Imagine sitting in a courtroom, the air thick with tension, as a police officer confidently takes the stand, his words sharp and deliberate. He's here to testify against a black woman accused of resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. The case seems straightforward. Another routine hearing where the system tips in favor of the badge. But what happens next shatters the illusion of control. The woman, calm and composed, stands to reveal her true identity. She's a high-ranking official in a U.S. intelligence agency. The room falls silent. The officer's lies begin to unravel, and the courtroom becomes a stage for a battle of truth, power, and justice. This isn't just a story about a courtroom drama. It's a tale of how one woman's courage exposes the cracks in a system designed to protect its own. It all started on a quiet evening in a suburban neighborhood. The woman, let's call her Agent Taylor, was driving home after a long day at work. She had no idea that a routine traffic stop would spiral into a life-altering confrontation. The officer, whose name we'll withhold for now, claimed she was speeding and behaving erratically. But Agent Taylor knew better. She had spent years in the intelligence community, trained to read situations and people with precision. She complied with the officer's requests, but things quickly escalated. The officer became aggressive, and before she knew it, she was handcuffed and charged with crimes she didn't commit. What followed was a months-long legal battle that tested her resolve. Agent Taylor, a woman who had dedicated her life to serving her country, now found herself fighting against the very system she had sworn to protect. Her career, her reputation, and her freedom were on the line. But she wasn't alone. Her colleagues in the intelligence community rallied behind her, providing evidence and support that would prove crucial in court. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just about one traffic stop gone wrong. It was about accountability, about whether those in power could be held to the same standards as everyone else. The courtroom scenes were nothing short of cinematic. The officer, confident in his version of events, painted Agent Taylor as a threat. But when it was her turn to speak, she dismantled his narrative piece by piece. She presented dashcam footage, witness testimonies, and even her own credentials, which revealed her position in the intelligence agency. The prosecution tried to discredit her, but the evidence was undeniable. The officer's story began to crumble, and the judge was left with no choice but to question the validity of the charges. But just when it seemed like justice would prevail, a new twist emerged. The officer's legal team introduced a surprise witness, someone who claimed to have seen the altercation from a different angle. Their testimony cast doubt on Agent Taylor's account, leaving the courtroom in a state of uncertainty. The tension was palpable as the judge called for a recess, leaving everyone wondering how this would end. Would Agent Taylor's truth be enough to overcome the system's bias? Or would the officer's lies prevail, leaving her career and freedom in jeopardy? As the trial resumed, Agent Taylor took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been wronged by those in power. It was about holding the system accountable, no matter how difficult the fight. The courtroom waited with bated breath as she prepared to deliver her final statement. But before she could speak, the officer's lawyer stood up, objecting to a piece of evidence that could change everything. The judge paused, considering the objection, and the screen faded to black. What happens next? You'll have to stay tuned to find out. This story isn't just about one woman's fight for justice. It's a reminder that the truth can be a powerful weapon, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the system seems stacked against you. And it's a call to question the narratives we're fed, to look beyond the surface and seek the truth. So, what do you think happened in that courtroom? Did Agent Taylor's position in the intelligence agency give her the upper hand, or did the system find a way to protect its own? The answers lie ahead, but one thing is certain. This story is far from over. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Agent Taylor sat at the defense table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She had been through countless high-stakes situations, in her career, but this was different. This wasn't a mission in a foreign country or a classified operation. This was her life, her freedom, and her reputation on the line. And now, with the officer's lawyer objecting to a critical piece of evidence, the tension in the room was unbearable. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience on the bench, raised an eyebrow and turned to the prosecution. "Counselor, what is the basis for this objection?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The officer's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a reputation for winning tough cases, stood up confidently. "Your Honor, this evidence was not disclosed to the defense during discovery. We had no opportunity to review or challenge its authenticity. Introducing it now would be highly prejudicial to my client's case." He glanced at Agent Taylor. A flicker of something. Was it doubt, annoyance recrossing his face? The prosecution, a young but determined attorney named Lisa Carter, quickly countered. "Your Honor, this evidence was only recently uncovered, and it directly contradicts the officer's testimony. It's crucial to the defense's case, and withholding it would be a miscarriage of justice." The judge leaned back in her chair, considering the arguments. Agent Taylor's mind raced. The evidence in question was a piece of dashcam footage that had mysteriously gone missing after the traffic stop. It had taken weeks of digging, calls to old contacts, and favors called in from her colleagues in the intelligence community to recover it. The footage showed the officer becoming aggressive without provocation, his tone escalating as Agent Taylor remained calm and compliant. It was the smoking gun she needed to prove her innocence, but if the judge sided with the defense, it might never see the light of day. As the legal teams argued, Agent Taylor's thoughts drifted back to the night of the incident. She had been driving home after a long day at work, her mind preoccupied with a sensitive operation she was overseeing. The traffic stop had seemed routine at first, flashing lights in her rearview mirror, the officer's voice over the loudspeaker asking her to pull over. She had complied immediately, rolling down her window and placing her hands on the steering wheel, just as she had been trained to do in high-pressure situations. But something about the officer's demeanor had set off alarm bells. He was tense, his voice clipped, and his instructions contradictory. When he asked her to step out of the car, she had done so slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and non-threatening. But before she could explain herself, he had grabbed her arm, twisted it behind her back, and slammed her against the hood of her car. The pain had been sharp, but it was the shock of the situation that had left her reeling. She had identified herself as a federal agent, but the officer had dismissed her credentials, accusing her of lying to avoid arrest. The memory still haunted her. She had spent her career protecting her country, working in the shadows to keep others safe, and yet in that moment none of it had mattered. The badge she wore, the sacrifices she had made, none of it had shielded her from the officer's aggression. It was a harsh reminder of how fragile justice could be, especially for someone who looked like her. As a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field, she had always known that the odds were stacked against her, but she had never imagined it would come to this. Back in the courtroom, the judge finally made her decision. "I'll allow the evidence to be presented," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "But I'll give the defense time to review it before we proceed." The officer's lawyer frowned but nodded, knowing better than to push back. Agent Taylor exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. But the battle was far from over. The officer, sitting stiffly at the plaintiff's table, glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Was that fear in his eyes? Anger? She couldn't tell. What she did know was that this case was about more than just her. It was about every person who had ever been wronged by the system, every voice that had been silenced, every truth that had been buried. As the court adjourned for the day, Agent Taylor stepped outside, the cool evening air a welcome relief after the stifling tension of the courtroom. Her legal team huddled around her, discussing strategy for the next day. But her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. Why had the officer been so quick to escalate the situation? Why had the dashcam footage gone missing? And who was the surprise witness the defense had mentioned? The questions swirled in her mind, each one leading to more uncertainty. That night, as she lay in bed, Agent Taylor replayed the events of the trial in her head. She thought about the officer's testimony, the way he had confidently lied under oath, and the way the system had seemed to protect him at every turn. She thought about her colleagues in the intelligence community who had risked their careers to help her, and she thought about the countless others who didn't have the resources or the platform to fight back. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for justice, for accountability, for the truth. The next morning, as she walked back into the courtroom, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The judge called the court to order, and the prosecution prepared to present the dashcam footage. But just as the video was about to play, the officer's lawyer stood up again. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to call my witness to the stand." The judge nodded, and the room turned to the doors at the back. A man walked in, his face familiar but out of place. Agent Taylor's heart skipped a beat. She recognized him instantly. He was a former colleague, someone she had worked with on a classified operation years ago. What was he doing here? And whose side was he on? The man took the stand, his expression unreadable. The officer's lawyer began his questioning, and the room waited with bated breath. What would he say? How would his testimony change the course of the trial? Agent Taylor clenched her fists under the table, her mind racing. The stakes had just gotten higher, and the truth felt further away than ever. The screen faded to black once more, leaving the audience hanging on the edge of their seats. What would happen next? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was clear. This story was far from over. The courtroom was electric with anticipation as the witness, Agent Taylor's former colleague, settled into the stand. His name was Mark Harris, and his presence sent a ripple of unease through the room. Agent Taylor's mind raced. She hadn't seen Mark in years, not since they had worked together on a high-stakes operation overseas. Back then, he had been a trusted ally, someone she had relied on in life-or-death situations. But now, as he sat there, his face unreadable, she couldn't help but wonder why he was here. Was he here to help her? Or had he been brought in to undermine her case? The officer's lawyer began his questioning, his tone smooth and calculated. "Mr. Harris, can you please state your name and occupation for the record?" Mark cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward the microphone. "My name is Mark Harris, and I'm a former intelligence officer with the U.S. government." The lawyer nodded, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Mr. Harris. Now, can you tell the court about your professional relationship with the defendant, Agent Taylor?" Mark hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering toward Agent Taylor before he answered. "We worked together on several classified operations. She was highly skilled, one of the best in the field." The lawyer's smile widened. "But there was something unsettling about it. And would you say you know her well? Her character, her tendencies, her temperament?" Mark shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'd say I knew her as well as anyone could in our line of work. It's not exactly a job where you share personal details." The lawyer nodded again, as if this was exactly the answer he had been hoping for. "Of course. Now, Mr. Harris, I'd like to direct your attention to the night of the incident in question. Did you have any contact with Agent Taylor around that time?" Agent Taylor's heart sank. She hadn't spoken to Mark in years, but the implication was clear. The defense was trying to paint her as someone with a history of erratic behavior. Mark glanced at her again, his expression unreadable. "No, I hadn't spoken to her in a long time before that night." The lawyer pressed on, his tone sharper now. "But you were aware of her position in the intelligence community, correct? And you're familiar with the kind of stress that comes with that line of work?" Mark nodded slowly. "Yes, I am." The lawyer leaned in, his voice dropping slightly. "And would you say that stress can sometimes lead to unpredictable behavior?" The question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Agent Taylor's legal team immediately objected, arguing that the question was speculative and irrelevant. The judge sustained the objection, but the damage had been done. The Seed of doubt had been planted, and the jury's faces reflected the uncertainty. Agent Taylor clenched her fists under the table, her mind racing. What was Mark doing? Why was he allowing the defense to twist his words like this? She wanted to stand up to demand answers, but she knew she had to stay calm. This was a game, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the questioning continued, Mark's testimony became even more troubling. He spoke about the pressures of their work, the toll it took on mental health, and the occasional lapses in judgment that could occur under extreme stress. He never directly accused Agent Taylor of anything, but his words were carefully chosen, each one adding another layer of doubt to her case. By the time he stepped down from the stand, the courtroom was buzzing with whispered conversations. Agent Taylor's legal team huddled together, discussing their next move, but she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about the traffic stop anymore. This was about her entire career, her reputation, and the system's willingness to believe a black woman over a police officer. Outside the courtroom, the media had caught wind of the story. News vans lined the streets, reporters shouting questions as Agent Taylor and her team made their way to the car. She kept her head down, her face a mask of calm, but inside, she was seething. How had it come to this? How had a routine traffic stop turned into a national spectacle? She knew the answer, of course. It was about power, about who had it and who didn't. And right now, the scales were tipped against her. That night, Agent Taylor sat in her hotel room staring at the city lights outside her window. She couldn't sleep, her mind too full of questions and what-ifs. She thought about Mark, about the way he had looked at her in the courtroom. Was he being coerced, threatened, or had he simply chosen to side with the system that had protected him for so long? She didn't know, but she was determined to find out. Pulling out her laptop, she began digging into Mark's recent activities, searching for any clues that might explain his sudden appearance in her case. Hours later, she found something, a series of encrypted emails between Mark and an unknown sender. She couldn't access the content, but the timing was suspicious. The emails had started just days after her arrest, around the same time the dashcam footage had gone missing. Her instincts told her this was no coincidence. Someone had orchestrated this, someone who didn't want the truth to come out. But who and why? The next morning, as she walked back into the courtroom, Agent Taylor felt a renewed sense of determination. She didn't know what the day would bring, but she was ready to fight. The judge called the court to order, and the prosecution prepared to present the dashcam footage. But before they could begin, the officer's lawyer stood up again. "Your Honor, we have one more witness we'd like to call." The judge nodded, and the room turned to the doors at the back. A woman walked in, her face familiar but out of place. Agent Taylor's breath caught in her throat. It was the officer's partner, the one who had been with him during the traffic stop. What was she doing here, and whose side was she on? The woman took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she swore to tell the truth. The officer's lawyer began his questioning, his tone deceptively calm. "Officer Ramirez, can you please state your name and occupation for the record?" The woman nodded, her voice shaky but clear. "My name is Maria Ramirez, and I'm a police officer with the same department as Officer Daniels." The lawyer nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Officer Ramirez. Now, can you tell the court what happened on the night of the incident?" Officer Ramirez hesitated, her eyes darting toward Agent Taylor before she answered. "We were on patrol when we noticed a car speeding. We pulled it over and things escalated." The lawyer leaned in, his voice dropping slightly. "And by escalated, what do you mean?" Officer Ramirez swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the stand. "Officer Daniels, he became aggressive. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen. And then, he arrested her." The room erupted in murmurs, the tension reaching a boiling point. Agent Taylor's legal team exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and hope. This was it, the moment they had been waiting for. But as Officer Ramirez continued her testimony, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a straightforward victory. She spoke about the pressure to back up her partner, the fear of retaliation if she spoke out, and the guilt that had been eating away at her ever since. Her words were raw and unfiltered, a rare glimpse into the inner workings of a system that often closed ranks to protect its own. By the time she stepped down from the stand, the courtroom was in chaos. The judge called for order, but the damage had been done. The officers' lies were unraveling, but so was the fragile trust that held the system together. Agent Taylor sat quietly, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every officer who had ever stayed silent, every victim who had ever been ignored, and every person who had ever questioned whether justice was truly blind. As the court adjourned for the day, Agent Taylor stepped outside, the weight of the trial heavy on her shoulders. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. The fight was far from over. The screen faded to black once more, leaving the audience hanging on the edge of their seats. What would happen next? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was clear. This story was far from over.